Good morning and welcome to the 18th meeting in 2019 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. The first item on the agenda this morning is to warmly welcome our new member, Alec Rowley, onto the committee and invite Alex to declare any relevant interests.
Thank you, Convener. I would refer to my registry interests.
Thank you very much, Alex. Can I just take this opportunity at this stage as well to thank James Kelly for his hard and diligent work and his time on the committee as well. It was very valuable. The second item on our agenda this morning is to take evidence from the Scottish Fiscal Commission on their forecast evaluation report. I therefore welcome Dame Susan Rice, who is the chair of the Fiscal Commission, Professor Francis Breeden, who is a commissioner, Professor Alistair Smith, who is a commissioner, and John Ireland, who is the chief executive of the commission. Dame Susan Rice, would you wish to make an opening statement?
Yes, I would, Convener, and thank you very much. Good morning to everyone, and yet again, thank you for the chance to give evidence in our work. Last Wednesday, we published 3 reports, including our annual forecast evaluation report and statement of data needs, and I'll refer to these. I'm also conscious that the convener wrote to me in June asking the Commission to provide an evaluation of the Scottish Government's forecast of 2017-18 income tax receipts. There's a detailed explanation in our report of why this forecast was £941 million, or 8.6% higher than the outturn published by HMRC in July. I'll come back to this in a minute and mention also the implications for next year's budget. But before I do that, I want to highlight something which you've all been supportive of in the past and where we feel we've made some progress. Our evaluation report gives a number of examples that show the importance of good quality data sources and information. One is income tax itself, where HMRC outturn data were not available until last year. Now that we're able to make use of this new data source, our forecasts have improved. We face similar challenges when forecasting new benefits. We underestimated spending on the new pregnancy and baby grant by £2.5 million, or 59%, because of an unexpectedly large number of claims in the first few days after launch. The early data on claims for this grant, combined with a better appreciation of the Scottish Government's approach to launching new benefits, led the Commission to increase its forecasts of spending in May. While forecasting new and reformed benefits will always be difficult as the benefits become established and we have new data sources, we'd expect our forecast errors to reduce over time. But during the next few years, we should expect some volatility and fairly large forecast errors for Social Security as more benefits are devolved and the Scottish Government introduces reforms to them. I'm pleased that our second statement of data needs documents good progress made since last year, including signing a memorandum of understanding with the DWP. It also sets out our requests for additional data and information for the coming year. We keep raising the bar. I'll now return to the income tax forecast for 2017-18, which was made by the Scottish Government in February 2017. This is the question you posed to us. At the time, the Commission's role was to scrutinise Scottish Government forecasts and sign them off as reasonable. That was before we had gone into statute. We did that for this forecast, and we judged it reasonable at the time. We now know that this forecast overestimated revenue by £941 million, or 8.6%. That's a significant error and 2.8 percentage points higher than the OBR's average 2-year ahead forecast error, which is a benchmark we use. We estimate that £820 million of that total 941, so £820 million of that error, was due to what we've labelled the 2016-17 baseline error, which was the result of having to use an imperfect survey data source that was 3 years old to estimate 16-17 income tax revenues as the starting point of the 17-18 forecast. So that was our baseline. Taking that amount away, it leaves £121 million of the £940 million to be explained. Our report shows that roughly 90 million of this error was because of the government's economic forecasts. Total earnings growth was overestimated by 0.2 percentage points. We describe this as quite a small forecast error. The remaining £30 million is explained by a combination of modelling issues, HMRC incorporation's estimates, and changes in the cost of UK policies. We all know that the reason the income tax forecast matters is that it feeds into the £204 million negative reconciliation in next year's Scottish budget. Our report takes some time to explain the reconciliation which arises from differences in both our own forecasts and the OBR's forecasts. We hope we've made a start in this report in helping a wider understanding of the complexities of how the fiscal framework operates. I think you have copies of our new graphics to try to pick up on this, and we're happy to discuss those in due course. I know too that the OBR have written to you with an explanation of their UK income tax forecast error, and I won't stray too far into what's their territory. The key point in our explanation is that the £204 million reconciliation, it's a reconciliation between forecasts, has little to do with the £820 million 2016-17 baseline error I've just described. This is because the £820 million error equally affects the amount of additional funding Scotland receives through income tax and the amount of funding taken away through the block grant adjustment, so the net effect is zero. The reconciliation arises from the combination of the error in forecasting growth in Scottish income tax and the error in forecasting growth in the block grant adjustment using OBR forecasts. We think that the block grant adjustment was in effect underestimated by around £83 million, and growth in Scottish income tax revenues was overestimated by £121 million together. That gives us the negative £204 million reconciliation. Now, I'm afraid that there are a lot of numbers I've just gone through and a lot to absorb, particularly orally. You'll find them also in our report, and I expect that we'll go through these again as we answer some of your questions. So meanwhile, can I just thank you for your attention and your patience with me doing that? Thank you.
Thank you, Dame Susan Rice. Yes, a lot of numbers, so I won't start by asking you a question on numbers, just to make it a bit, not throw any more numbers into the picture. A question I've been asking myself, and I guess others might be doing the same, is to what extent the forecasting process will improve once we have more outturn data for the Scottish income tax, and to what extent is that likely to reduce the size of reconciliations in future, and if so, what sort of timescales should we expect this to happen if that was to be the scenario? With any devolved tax or benefit, as we get outturn data and more outturn data over the years, that gives us a much sounder base on which to prepare future forecasts. So the answer to the very first part of your question is yes, that will continue to improve, just as the first outturn data we got a little over a year ago made a huge difference to the quality of our forecast. In terms of timing, that will vary for each of the different taxes. And Alistair, do you want to speak to that, or?
Well, I think I would just say that, as Susan has already indicated, once we deal with the baseline error issue, the two forecast errors which go into the 2017-18 reconciliation are not actually very large. Roughly speaking, £100 million in the block grant adjustment, £100 million in our tax forecast. Now, as time passes, we would hope that everyone's forecasting performance improves. But given that these are relatively modest forecasting errors, I think it would be a mistake to suppose that somehow the reconciliation issue is going to go away. The 2017-18 reconciliation of just over 200 million is a significant number, deriving from not very large forecast errors. At the moment, it looks as if the 2018 reconciliation is going to be quite a lot bigger. That's really a feature of the fiscal framework within which we're operating, and it would not be sensible to suppose that somehow with the passage of time this issue is going to go away. It's a feature of the system, and we have to recognise that.
I think it's helpful to keep in mind that when we use the term reconciliation, we're talking about reconciling differences in forecasts, So the BGA is partly influenced by the OBR's forecast of what's happening at the UK and partly influenced by our forecast. So it's a reconciliation of forecast differences. Outturn data is actually what happened, and that's when we talk about forecast error, because we know what did happen compared to what our forecast was. So they're two somewhat different processes.
Obviously, I think most of us will understand the baseline issue, and that was reconciliation is probably the wrong word, but it was a different type of adjustment that is now out of the system. But what Alice has just told us is that over the coming years, whilst it might not be of that scale in terms of baseline, that's potential for a couple $100 million, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, year on year out from here, and it might be to the negative, it might be to the positive. What you're really describing is, and while that might not be a big number in terms of the impact on the statistically, it could still be a big number in terms of what any government's going to do with public expenditure.
That's correct.
So what you're really telling us is that because of the fiscal framework, we're in for a pretty bumpy ride on this issue over a long period of time.
Yeah, I think that's a relatively fair assessment. Yeah, I mean it's something that has to be factored into the budget process because as Susan said, I mean there were two forecast errors going into this, ours and the OBR's, and the OBR has a very long track record of forecasting, and yet it's still making errors. So we have to assume that's an ongoing situation.
I might sort of put a caveat and say not simply because of the fiscal framework. The fiscal framework is complex, and that's absolutely fair, and we're still feeling our way, all of us, through it. But there are other factors that also influence, which is the quality of data that I've been talking about. And that's why we keep asking for better, more timely data. And also, just to keep in mind, we're talking about income tax reconciliations. We will have reconciliations across taxes and our social security benefits over time as well. So it is complicated.
Yeah, understand it's complicated.
Yeah.
It's bumpy.
Yep.
What can we do as a committee to help make it less turbulent for both sides of this equation, both the UK government and the Scottish government?
John?
So I think one of the things which is driving the reconciliation errors is around estimates of total earnings. So in a sense, total earnings from the economic forecast feed into our income tax forecasts, and quite small errors in those total earnings forecasts are driving quite a lot of the reconciliation parts. So one of the things that we asked for in our annual statement of data needs was for some work to be done on Scottish earnings data. As you'll remember from previous committee hearings, the average earnings data for Scotland is, we have a number of indicators, but we don't have anything which actually allows us to sort of see very clearly what the position on average earnings is. So I think one of the things that could help is pressure from the committee on ONS and the Scottish Government to start thinking and working on improving the quality of earnings data in Scotland. I think that would help.
Okay. Murdo.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I've got a couple of questions on the income tax reconciliations more generally, but before I come to them, I just want to follow up the Convener's first questions around the scale of the reconciliations. And Professor Smith, what you were saying was the first 3 years, if you like, are outliers, and we should settle down, all being well, to a much smaller range of variation in future years. One of the things the committee has been considering is, in terms of the current fiscal framework, the Scottish Government's borrowing powers, and whether they are sufficient to deal with the peaks and troughs that might arise from forecast error. Is there anything that you think what your report tells us and what your views are that should lead us to any particular conclusions about the level of borrowing powers currently available to the Scottish Government?
Well, it's not really for the Fiscal Commission to advise on any redesign of the fiscal framework, but if I can just pick up first on, you said I'd implied that somehow the reconciliations issue is going to settle down after the first 2 or 3 rocky years. And if I give that impression, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant to say. The 2017 reconciliation that we're looking at in this year's forecast evaluation report arises from two relatively modest forecasting errors. It looks as if there's going to be a bigger reconciliation next year. This year's, it would be very ambitious to say that we're going to, in a few years' time, be looking at smaller forecasting errors than we've seen this year. These are relatively modest errors. And it's more productive, I think, to, as you went on to ask, what does that say about the framework? And it's right. These are relatively small numbers compared with the size of the income tax that's raised in Scotland. They're relatively small errors by the standards of reasonable forecasting errors, but they're big sums of money relative to the Scottish Government's borrowing powers. And that's where they bite, that the Scottish Government's borrowing powers are sufficiently limited that coping with ups and downs, and hopefully some years the reconciliations will be ups and they won't always be downs. But coping with ups and downs of several hundred million is quite a lot of variation relative to the borrowing powers. But as I said, it's not for the Fiscal Commission to advise on whether the Scottish Government's borrowing powers should be changed.
Could I just add a footnote to that, which is as the social security benefits come over to Scotland, and Scotland is then responsible for making those expenditures, and there's often an unknown quantity because we don't know how many individuals will qualify at any one point in time for a particular benefit. The borrowing powers may be used to smooth some of that. So I'm not commenting on the policy here, but the borrowing powers become more important and may be more actively required.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask Convener about more generally about the income tax receipts and as against forecasts? In your report, and we've also heard this from you previously in evidence, an indication that part of the explanation for the gap that has arisen is because relative to the rest of the UK, there's been a slower growth in Scottish income tax, which is a consequence of slower overall wages growth. To what extent is that down to faster growing employment rates in the rest of the UK compared to Scotland, and or faster wage growth in the rest of the UK per capita?
Part of it is down to the demographic of the population in Scotland, where we have an increasing demographic of people who have come to an age where they cease to be actively employed in so-called day jobs compared to the rest of the UK. But I don't know if one of my colleagues wants to answer the question more specifically. Francis? No?
I'm not sure. No, I think that's totally quite difficult to unravel. I mean, one thing also to add is there's the issue about the amount of, one of the upside surprises in the UK has been the amount raised from the higher income brackets, and that's been less of an element in Scotland. But precisely on your question, I'm afraid I don't have the numbers. I don't know if John...
There are some numbers in the full report for this, which I don't think you've got in front of you, but we can point you to table 2.5 in the full report on page 23, and that looks at forecast on outturn growth in income tax determinants for Scotland and UK. You're asking about employment. The Scottish Government's forecast of employment was 0.3% growth, and the outturn data was 1.5%. So the forecast, which went into income tax, was actually underestimated employment growth. UK employment growth over the same period was actually grew at 1.0%, and the OBR's forecast was 0.1. So what happened here is that the OBR underestimated employment growth. So you have both those forecasts underestimating employment growth. I could read the rest of the table out, but it sort of goes in a similar way. But the important thing is the relative growth rates of average earnings. And in Scotland, the outturn was 2.4%, and in the UK it was 4%. So it's the total earnings growth which is really important.
Earnings growth then is about...
It's more... The real one to look at is total earnings growth.
Okay, and going back to Professor Breeden's point a second ago, that's more because there are more higher earners in the UK average than relatively there are in Scotland, and that's where the larger wages growth has been.
Certainly in terms of where the income tax revenue increase in the UK came from was coming from that element. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Continuing that theme of the wage growth, and I'll come to John Mason, who I know is interested in the income tax area as well. In our report on the budget in 17-18, our advisor highlighted that at that stage lower wage growth in Scotland than the rest of the UK, and that was a risk to the budget. That now appears to be a pretty astute analysis, considering where we are. I just wonder, to what extent did the SFC examine that risk when you were assessing the forecasts in 2016? Now, I know there would be Scottish Government forecast, but you were looking at their detail. So, what extent did you examine that risk at that time?
I'm the only one who can answer that, I think, and it's hard for me to say to what extent we, at that stage, were just all of us learning. We looked at previous years of growth. Remember, that was, the economy, everything has moved on since that point in time. The whole of the UK was at that point only for a couple of years coming out of the impact of the financial crisis. So what we did then was to look back and look at growth, and we looked at what we believed was happening in Scotland. We have since that time been asking for better and more timely earnings data for Scotland. That is really important to us. So we did consider it, but what we had to consider was a backward look, because this was a first start.
If I can add just one thing. Yes, the data is important. Scottish data on earnings is not as good as the UK-wide data, as both John and Susan have now referred to. But we also have to recognise that lots of people are puzzled about what has happened in labour markets over the last 10 years. Not just in Scotland, not just in the UK, but across the developed world. And we none of us have a very good understanding of the way that labour market behaviour has changed in the last 10 years. So this is going to be a continuing source of uncertainty.
Thank you. John.
Thanks, Convener. It was kind of on this data area. I've had 3 years since I was on this committee, so things may have changed a little bit. I see Susan Rice, however, is still here. Previously, when I was in the committee, I mean, first of all, there was a problem that the data just wasn't there. So, I mean, with the best will in the world, nobody could give you. And it seems to me that the main problem in here is that the 16-17 data just wasn't there, and we've now got it. So we understand better. Is that, well, one, is that correct? And I suppose I'm wondering too then, how solid is the data now, or are we expecting improvements going forward? Because anecdotally, I had a letter from HMRC telling me that they assumed I didn't live in Scotland. And I just wonder how much we trust the HMRC data, or if there's room for improvement in that as well.
I'll give a quick answer, but then maybe turn to John, possibly, to put some flesh around that. So the 16-17, the baseline data, was based on a report that existed at the time on 3-year-old data. At a time of economic turmoil and change and so forth. So, but it was the only data we could use. So, yeah, you're right. To say it's right or wrong, it wasn't what we would have wanted at that point in time. We needed to do something. In an ideal world, I suppose, you would get all of your data collection and sources absolutely where they should be, and then you would devolve taxes. But clearly that isn't the real world, and so we devolved, and the data has improved along the way. It is certainly better now than it has been, and increasing years of better data also amplify the positive effect of that. But John, you want to give some more detail?
Yeah. So the data which wasn't there back when these forecasts were made was the outturn data. And we now had 2 years worth of outturn data. It's helpful because it allows us to compare the survey of personal incomes, which is the sample survey of administrative data, with the actual outturn. So we actually do have outturn data now, and that's a very helpful thing. In terms of the survey of personal incomes, we have been working with HMRC and the Scottish Government to try and improve that survey for Scotland, and it's certainly true that since these forecasts were made that we're talking about now, that survey of personal incomes has also improved. And one area it's improved particularly is in the treatment of the earnings at the very top of the range, which used to be composite-wide UK, composite records for the UK as a whole, and now that's for Scotland. So there have been improvements in the underlying survey of personal income as well. The other element of data that we have now, which we didn't have back then, is something called real-time information. So this is the real-time information which comes from people's pay-as-you-earn submissions. That's now starting to be available for Scotland. What we're concerned about is its relationship with the underlying outturn data, and we don't think enough work has been done to sort of try and match up the story that real-time information is providing against the outturn data. And we've asked HMRC in our data statement to do more work there.
Correctly, there's been quite a big improvement.
A lot of improvement,
but
yes.
you are looking for further improvement. Yes.
So worth adding that it actually is also suggests the track record of the data, that we'll get better and understand the data better when we see a longer time series of outturns. At the moment, we have a range of indicators. We're still trying to work out which ones are the most useful, and the more history we have of them, the more we can judge. So even that element will improve as well.
I mean, can I ask in general, but especially HMRC, I mean, in the past I got the impression from them that they saw themselves as UK bodies and it was not part of their job to provide Scottish or Welsh or anything subset data, and we would have to perhaps pay for that if we wanted it. I mean, has that attitude changed, or...?
We have worked hard from the Fiscal Commission, our colleagues, to work with teams and individuals in HMRC, and the relationship is growing. This is about relationship, about two different teams working together. They can't do everything for us when we want it, because they have a bigger brief, but they certainly have been helpful, and they listen to us. John, do you want
Could
to...
I add to that?
Yeah.
The income tax team in HMRC over the last 2 years, has actually been doing a lot of work, and they've been working very closely with the government and with us on these issues. I think the personal relationships are good. The HMRC team actually came up to Scotland and spent almost a week here talking to us and the Scottish government, and that's very good. We have regular liaison meetings with them, both by phone and down in London as well. So I think those relationships are good, and I think HMRC are taking our data needs around income tax very, very seriously. It is true that the Scottish Government pays HMRC money for administration of collecting Scottish income tax, and I think my understanding is that some of that money is now finding its way towards the analysts in HMRC, and that's helping with this process. So I think things are very positive in terms of those relationships, and HMRC on income tax are being very responsive.
Maybe my final point on this would be, I mean, are you getting all the information you need from the Scottish Government as well?
Yeah, the primary suppliers here are HMRC, but certainly on income tax, the Scottish Government again being helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John. Alex?
Thank you, Convener. Note my register of interests around property. Good morning. My questions on LBTT and particularly the residential error, and particularly on figure 4.4. I just wonder what further analysis or breakdown you're able to provide on the brackets on the decrease within the brackets, and also on the transactions. What further analysis and what breakdown if you're able to provide any on by region of drop in transactions?
Not by region, but I think what we can say is that it is a very difficult tax to forecast, because it's related to the number of transactions that occur. So we need to know how many transactions occur, what's happening to average house prices, and then the third element is what's the distribution of those transactions, and that's the element that we struggled with this time around, was that there are about 4,000, on average, about 4,000 transactions that generate about half the revenue from this tax. And so you can imagine if you just get a few of those wrong, you can really, make an error. And so it was that higher element that was the key element of where our forecast error came from, was in these higher value, which attract a higher tax rate and are high value, and therefore are really quite important for the total revenue from the tax.
So can you provide a further breakdown of the brackets for the decrease?
By bracket, not directly, no. I think, let's see if that's...
You comment that it's dropped in the top two brackets. I presume there is some analysis there?
Yeah, so what we did was, it's fair to say it wasn't a drop. So what happened was that the value of transactions in that higher group had been trending upwards, and we had forecast a continued increase in that in the number of transactions in that higher bracket, and in fact it was pretty much flat. So that was where the error came from, was us expecting further increases in the share from that high value area.
Okay. Now, anecdotal evidence from estate agents has suggested that in some parts of the country, sales in the top two brackets have dropped to near zero. I'm just wondering, when you look at you've separated out into drops in share in top tax brackets and drop in total transactions. Now, many individual transactions are obviously a part of a chain of transactions. So when you lose one, you're actually losing a multiple effect. Would it be fair to say you're looking at it's the same problem here? Would you do any analysis between the relationship between that drop in top tax bracket and the total transactions?
What we've been doing over the summer is we've been basically rebuilding the model that we use for this, and it is basically one of the things we're trying to do is allow the distribution of transactions across the value to be a bit more variable. We were slightly imposing a shape on the how many high value transactions relative to how many low. That was our and now we're allowing that to be a bit more data driven, which I think will help deal with the issue you're raising. I mean, it's not directly, but it's a way of allowing more flexibility to those sorts of issues to come through.
Okay, and finally, you're not planning on collecting any of that transaction data by region of Scotland?
Not at this stage, no.
Okay. Thank you.
Gordon. Just to continue this discussion, having a look at your main report, it highlights that total transactions was 18 million of the 42, and 22 million was the share in the top tax brackets. So that's 40 of the 42. Were you able to identify the reasons for this shortfall? Was it as a result of a slowdown in the economy? Was it a result of policy change, or was it a result of uncertainty over, say, Brexit? Was there any identification?
I mean, we haven't really got anything that detailed to say, and I think it's fundamentally, from our point of view, an error. I think it is because I think as I said at the beginning, this is a difficult tax to forecast in any situation because the number of transactions varies and the scale of transactions varies so much year on year. So at this point, we see that as just a part of the general difficulty in forecasting this type of tax revenue.
And to be fair, you could almost ask that question the other way around. What caused the steeper growth in those top two tax bands the previous couple of years, and have we returned more to a norm? I don't know, but you can ask that either way.
And on the non-residential side, in your report you said the non-residential forecast was close to the outturn figure, although we think this was a result of cancelling out between more release and higher price and transaction growth. So can you say a wee bit more about the compensating errors that were in there and what it would have been if they hadn't happened?
I think, here, as I say, the key element that we saw is where the errors are coming from is on the area of appeals. So I think that's where, and there we think the appeals, will come through later on. Sorry, NDR. Sorry,
NDR as opposed to non-residential.
Sure, sorry, I thought you said it. Sorry, non-residential. Sorry.
Well, if I can just throw in one comment on non-residential, table 4.10 shows that our forecast was 190 and the outturn was 193. And I think the most important thing to say about that is that's very close. Now, underneath the 193, there were some ups and downs, but there are always going to be some ups and downs. And let's just say that was a very good forecast.
No, listen, I appreciate that, and I know it's difficult to predict the future. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but we had a situation where the forecast for residential was higher than the outturn, and in non-residential, forecast was below what the outturn was. And I'm just wondering, was it different methodologies that took place there, and is there going to be any changes in how that's calculated moving forward?
There are very different methodologies. So in the residential, we have a relatively complex model because the data allows us to do that, and the banding helps there. In non-residential, it's a relatively simple model. I found the relevant bit in the report, and basically in the non-residential, both price growth and transaction growth were above our forecast, so we under forecast both transaction and price growth. But it's a much simpler model for non-residential, partly because it's so volatile and lumpy, because it's a very small number of commercial transactions which sort of dominate this.
Watch. I think you have some questions in social security forecasting.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning to the Commissioners. It seems to me that how well plugged in you are to social security policy is central to how accurate your forecasts are. And while, some benefits are a wee bit off, they come on stream one by one. The government has made a big play that the people who use or receive the benefits are crucial to informing policy. So, as well as stakeholders, you've got experience panels, you've got the Social Security Commission that's scrutinising regulations. And I suppose what I would like to know is how do all these factors in the development of policy inform your forecasts, and do you, for example, really scrutinise social security regulations as well?
So, and I want to use words correctly here. As you know, we don't get involved in the development of policy. We wouldn't go to the government and say your regulation has flaws. So we wouldn't do that. But for doing our forecasts, which we understand are really important, we need to understand what is the population that might be eligible for a particular benefit, and then what proportion of that population might take it or not, because not everyone eligible will take up that benefit. And when a new benefit comes online, we need to understand from the government how it may be reforming or changing eligibility, timetabling, whatever, because that we don't have much past data to use for these new benefits. And so we need to understand those basic elements, and just when the new benefit, at what point in the year it might be launched. So those are some of the elements that we do consider. Are you looking for us to...
let me be clear, I'm not for a minute suggesting it's your job to comment on social security policy. I suppose I'm suggesting that you need to understand what social security policy is, or what some of the proposals are, and how that will affect behaviour and take-up rates, etc. So maybe if we look a bit more at the Best Start grant. So the government has a legal responsibility as part of the Social Security Act that passed eons ago to promote uptake, actually for all benefits, not just devolved ones, if my memory serves me right. And with the Best Start grant, there are some very distinct policy differences, for example, around second and subsequent children, that has a bearing on financial outlay and therefore the forecast. So what I'm keen to understand is if you can demonstrate from the outset of when you were doing your forecasts that you were really tuned in to what the policy was, and, did things like the commitment around second and subsequent children, figure in your work?
Oh, absolutely. And we discussed that at length, made a judgment that if someone had the grant for their first baby, they were much more likely to take it for their second one because they know how it works and it's easy to do and so on. So the answer there is yes, but let me back away from the actual process of forecasting and say that Social Security Scotland, as you know, is a new body, and we know what it's like to be a new body. It's a lot of work. We have engaged with them and tried to learn what they're about. I mean, I think that's part of what you're saying is just to understand you know, and they're learning as they go as well, as they launch subsequent benefits. So there's an iterative thing happening here as well. We've had some private sessions with the Social Security Committee, and we'll be speaking to them in this kind of format in a couple of weeks. So we've tried to engage in various ways. Alistair, do you want to add to that?
Well, if I can pursue the Best Start grant one, because that's a good example. Yes, on each of these social security benefits, the staff team have a lot of detailed discussions with DWP and with the Scottish Government, and we're always aware that the detailed changes in the benefits are very important to understand if we're going to make reasonable forecasts. And in the case of Best Start grant, the eligibility for children beyond the second child was clearly a factor that came into it. The striking thing which we learned from the Best Start grant is that the details of how the policy is launched by the government can have a very big effect. It had a dramatic effect in the case of Best Start grant. And what seems to have happened was the government launched it with a great deal of vigour, and parents who were entitled under the previous UK benefit very quickly learned that actually it was better not to apply for the previous benefit, although they were eligible for it, because they also came into the window for Best Start grant, and Best Start grant was more valuable to them. So the take-up of Best Start grant by parents of children who were already born before the grant was launched was one of the factors that led to the forecasting error. And I think that's probably something that the Social Security team and the Scottish Government have learned, as well as us, the strong sensitivity to quite detailed issues about how quickly potential beneficiaries learn about it and how easy it is for them to compare the benefits to them under one benefit rather than another.
I don't want my next question to sound obtuse, but no buts. So, when my son hands in his maths homework, teacher always says to him, you need to show your workings and not just the answer that you've done in your head. So, if committee was to ask commissioners for any of your workings on any of the forecasts on any of these benefits, is there work that you could show us that was done at the time?
Put a great deal on our website in terms, I mean, we are try to be really transparent about what goes into our models and the bases.
So the forecast reports we published at the time contain a lot of information about the sort of the judgments, and in particular the judgments about take-up and how they were informed by issues such as the ones that you've mentioned. So there's a lot of the working shown there. The other part of the working is the models that we have, and the models, in a sense, are another part of this, because the models, these sorts of models, are very, very closely based upon the rules for the policy. And these models we share with the Scottish Government. They tend to be Excel spreadsheets and models of that sort of nature. We share those with the Scottish Government so they can see our workings, very, very closely. And part of the forecast process is actually meeting with the government, with policy people from the government, and with analysts, where they go over our homework and mark it with probably more vigour than the maths teacher does. But it feels like that at times. So in a sense, our workings are pretty transparent there. We haven't shared those models externally outside with the government yet, in part because no one has asked us for us, and in part because I think some of them contain a little bit of information from DWP which is not in the public domain.
Okay. If I can add there one other element, which is that in the end, in all our forecasting, but especially in the Social Security forecasting, there are a very strong element of judgment. So on all of these individual forecasts, there has been the kind of modelling that John has described. There have been the kind of interaction with the policy teams. There have been meetings between the commissioners and government officials. And in the end, it comes down to, well, do we think that the take-up rate of this new benefit is going to be a lot higher than the old benefit? because it's more generous, or is it going to be lower because beneficiaries are going to take time to learn about the new benefit? And we, in the end, it's not a matter of maths working, it's a matter of having heard all of the evidence, some of it quite qualitative and subjective. We then say, well, actually, we think take-up rates are probably going to fall in this sort of area. So that's a very important element in all of these social security forecasts.
Okay. So in terms of really appreciating what you've learned and your partners, what they've learned and what everybody needs to do differently, while there was no financial consequence or fiscal consequence of the forecast error and carers allowance, and you like committee and parliamentarians, are waiting on two governments coming to agreements about work and timescales, etc. So there will be things that you won't know at the time of your forecasts. But how will you really learn from that, given actually what's coming down the track are bigger and more complex benefits in that around 350,000 people receive some form of disability assistance?
Well, just specifically pulling on the carers allowance, the forecast error we had, most of that was due to our forecasting the cost of that benefit for an entire year, because we had fairly vague sense that it might be launched in the summer, but we didn't know when the carers allowance supplement would run for the whole year. So again, that's a matter of judgment. So that was our first go, and we took a judgment, we'll do something. When we've re-looked at our forecast and done it on the part year, the carers allowance actually after it had been launched, our forecast error was really quite small. So what we've learned, and we talked to Social Security Scotland as well, is that the better and more timely information we have about their plans to launch a new benefit, as well as the details of the benefit, but the timing of launch can make a big difference to the outcome. So that's one learning.
And to pick up specifically your question about the £3 billion of disability benefits being devolved, yes, that's a very big issue, and that loops back to our earlier discussion of reconciliations. We will be looking at £3.5 billion of devolved social security expenditure, the forecasting of which is subject, with the best will in the world, to the kinds of errors that we've already been discussing in a much more modest context, where the forecast will depend on details of eligibility for new benefits, which are different from the previous benefits, details on how the benefits are launched. But we've got forecasts totaling, we will have forecasts of the order of £3.5 billion, subject to quite a lot of uncertainty, to add to the earlier uncertainties we were talking about in relation to income tax forecasting. So it's going to be a very significant issue.
Final question, Convener. Taking all that on board and looking to the future, does the Commission have any thoughts about what would help or hinder the budget setting process, particularly when you are trying to manage demand-led spend? And I wonder whether there was any consideration given to forecasts with ranges of spending rather than one fixed point, taking into account that behavioural changes can sometimes be difficult to predict or understand.
I think we do a lot of those sensitivity analysis already. But the trouble is that's very difficult to translate into how you use that in the budget. So we can give you a range of start dates, a range of take-up rates, but then somewhere along the process there has to be a decision as to which one is going to be used, and I think that's where the issue arises.
But our approach is that we will cost and use stated government policies. We don't just do a lot of trial runs.
Neil, you had a question on GDP, I think.
We've seen uncertainties in measuring GDP, and we've also, there's concerns about the strength of the link between GDP and tax revenues. You've said this morning we need more data on, or more quality data on earnings, for example. But GDP does indicate how well the economy is performing. So it begs the question, how much should we be interested in GDP forecasts?
Well, we have to be interested in the GDP forecast because it's part of the backbone of our overall economy forecast, which then has this direct link to income tax forecasting. So it's actually quite important.
I think it's fair to say that ultimately our interest is in tax revenue, and so GDP is a step along the way of getting there.
With one proviso that the government's borrowing requirements depend upon a test of relative growth of GDP between Scotland and the UK. I think perhaps your question is sort of aiming at some of the sort of recent work the government's been doing about thinking about alternative measures of GDP which capture different aspects of sort of well-being, perhaps.
It wasn't specifically related to that, but I know there is a debate about that ongoing. But it was to what? I mean, obviously, I'm not saying we shouldn't be interested in it. It wasn't a question whether we should or not, but it's to what extent, given the factors that you've raised this morning.
Well, one reason to be interested in it is looking at the longer run, and the longer run is an important part of the way that our GDP forecast is constructed, even if the headline numbers are what our GDP growth rate is a year ahead. But if you look back at the way the forecasts are done, we pay a lot of attention to long-run trends of productivity. So the short-run GDP forecast reflects, to some extent, a view of where the Scottish economy is going in the long run. And in some respects, that's one of the most important questions to ask about the Scottish economy is what are its long-term prospects for raising what have been, in recent years, disappointing levels of productivity growth and therefore long-run growth.
Other questions I'd like to ask of the Fiscal Commission? In which case, can I thank you very much for your evidence this morning. I'm going to give us a suspend for 10 minutes to allow a changeover of witnesses and before we get to our next item. The last item on our agenda is to take evidence on the Referendum Scotland Bill, and I welcome to this session Dr Theresa Reedy from the University of College Cork, Dr Andrew Mycock, who's a reader at the University of Huddersfield, Professor Chris Carman, Stevenson Trust for Citizenship, and Professor Toby James, who's Professor of Politics and Public Policy at the University of East Anglia. Can I first of all thank you all for your submissions, and I think we'll just go straight to questions. So the Scottish Government officials have explained to us that the intention of the bill is that it will be possible for the framework to be used for different polls, so there needs to be some flexibility on the circumstances and the packaging. To what extent do you think there is sufficient flexibility in the bill to allow for different referendums? Nice easy question for a starter. Who'd like to take it on to begin with? Toby, you look like... James, I mean. Oh, it's Toby, sorry.
That's right, yeah.
Toby.
I can have a go to start with. I mean, it certainly does allow a lot of flexibility. Obviously, allows that a lot of the detail can be, would come through a statutory instrument, secondary legislation, and if I recall rightly, there's also a provision in there for a minister to go and then actually change any provision of the Act. So I think there is an awful lot of flexibility in there, probably echoing some of the comments from colleagues from the week before. Maybe there's a little bit too much flexibility there insofar as perhaps some concerns that it would restrict parliamentary oversight of that. So I think it achieves that objective if the objective is flexibility, but I think it's probably too much in that direction.
Anyone like to comment at this stage? Theresa?
Probably just add in specific to the kind of campaign conditions. There's certainly a lot of flexibility included in here, but some of the discussion kind of suggests that all referendums are equal and indeed equally spirited and contentious and will naturally involve a lot of kind of high stakes engagement. But that's not necessarily the case. If you begin to use referendums as a tool quite frequently, you will inevitably come across technical issues which won't engage the public. And I suppose one thing that might be given a little bit more thought is what powers or what role the Electoral Commission could play at that point, and in particular looking at providing more impartial information to voters. So where there may not be active campaign participants in the field leading the debate, there is a requirement for there to be information provided to voters. And that does require the Electoral Commission to kind of step up to the mark and do something more perhaps than it might do in kind of hotly contested campaigns. And one other thing is in relation to financing. Again, if it's a kind of a technical issue, it may be that there aren't obvious, well-resourced campaign participants on the ground, and it could be that you might want to look at providing some small amounts of campaign funding, certainly probably encouraging umbrella organisations, because you do already have that structure, but incentivising umbrella organisations to form by providing funding. That this is really something that emerges when you begin to use referendums very frequently to deal with non-contentious issues.
That initial question, because I wondered to the panel, because I was thinking about this, is there a danger that in viewing the bill through the prism of one particular referendum, which has tended to be the last session that we're involved in around India F2, if it ever was to happen, that we might lose some of the sight of some of the flexibility and end up amending the bill to address concerns relating to a specific referendum, which may actually undermine the policy intent of creating a framework legislation in the first place. And I just wonder if anyone would like to reflect on that. Chris, I saw you nodding there. So.
No, I agree with that assertion. I mean, there is the problem that we have very specific example of referendums in our heads when we're thinking about this bill. And it is the case that you might want to consider, what are the issues on which we are really thinking that referendums can be held? Is it on any issue that's devolved, or how is the decision of what is an issue that on which a referendum can be held? Obviously, there is always some discussion about the extent to which devolved powers reach and don't reach into different areas. What's the body that adjudicates that? is that left to an independent body? I would assume you wouldn't want to put the Electoral Commission in on that because they tend to want to keep a step back from these sorts of contentious political issues. So then how are you going to decide that, and what's the mechanism for determining that? So I would agree that keeping in mind that referendums can be held, as Teresa just said, on a variety of issues, whether small technical sort of constitutional issues or whether larger, bigger issues that affect the public mind.
Andrew?
I think it's encouraging that this bill shows a sense of keenness for policy learning on previous experience of referenda. I think there are two substantive questions here, one which is about frequency of referenda, and at the moment that seems to be rather open-ended. I think the other thing which hasn't really been addressed is what triggers referenda, and often we find that that process is contentious in itself. In some parts of Europe, there are stipulated conventions which allow for it. I'm thinking of Switzerland and of the Republic of Ireland. I don't see that in the bill particularly here, and I think that that's something to think about, that there is that tension between the political process and purpose of these referenda, and I think that both those things need to be considered.
Anybody else want to respond at this stage? If not, in that case, Adam.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And just thank you. And before I ask my question, I must declare an interest that I, like Professor Carman, I'm a member of the professorial staff at the University of Glasgow. Thank you for reminding me about that, convener. I want to pick up on this, on just this line of questioning. The reason why this isn't a problem in UK law is because under the UK equivalent of this bill, namely PAPIRA, each referendum requires its own bespoke Act of Parliament. As introduced into this Parliament, this bill does not have that stipulation. Section 1 of this bill gives to Scottish ministers the power by regulations to provide for a referendum. Given that, unlike PAPIRA, this legislation won't require a bespoke Act of Parliament for each referendum, do you think that this bill needs to specify what the subject matters are within devolved competence that referendums should or might or could be held on? Or is the solution just to omit Section 1?
Chris, on you go.
In a sense, because that in a way refers back to what I was just saying about what is devolved competences. There's different ways that you could handle that. Either you can set up an independent commission of some sort that would take a view on whether or not devolved matters are. I'm reminded that over the years, the Petitions Committee, for instance, in the Scottish Parliament has taken very different views of what is devolved and what isn't, and the extent to which devolved powers reach into, say, the health sector and these sorts of issues. So these are contentious issues as to where devolution starts and stops. I think that then becomes a political decision to some extent. So there needs to be some mechanism, whether that is recognizing and allowing ministers to do it as the government of the day, which is one political decision, setting up an independent commission, another possibility. I suspect going so far as to try to regulate within the context of this bit of legislation for that would end up being quite difficult, being a minefield, and probably end up causing almost more problems if you try to specify specific areas within the context of the bill, because the level of specificity that you'd have to get to would be quite granular, I would imagine.
Let's take an example that is wholly within devolved competence, where there's no argument about whether it's devolved or reserved. That's the setting of the Scottish budget, and this is an example that I explored before the recess with the government's bill team. This is a parliament of minorities. It's designed to be a parliament of minorities. Let's suppose that the Cabinet Secretary for Finance can't get his or her budget through Parliament, and he or she decides to use the power under Section 1 to establish a referendum on whether the budget should be passed or not. Is that, given your, given your understanding of the international best practice on the use of referendums in parliamentary democracies, that the government bill team confirmed that, as drafted, this bill would enable a referendum in circumstances such as that? Is that good practice? Is that the kind of use of referendums that we should be contemplating in Scotland?
It would seem to enable a potentially very rapid expansion of the number of referendums that could be held and would be held. And that could have very profound consequences, both positive and negative. It would really, in many respects, change the nature of Scottish parliamentary democracy. It would make it much more direct. And there are advantages of that. I guess there are also disadvantages. I mean, referendums are, if you like, kind of the will of the majority, 52%, 55%, the 60%, and we have to think about minority kind of interests in there as well. So I think in allowing this to be kind of primary, to allow a minister to call a referendum in that way with that degree of speed, I think the committee might want to consider being kind of cautious about. Referendums are still relatively new territory, kind of globally, really. This is this is a relatively new era for referendums. It's certainly a new era for the United Kingdom and Scotland. So I think you'd have to be wary about how the situation that could lead into very, very frequent referendums being called, and that is a really very major change.
I think what you're looking at is fundamental change of Scottish political culture if you are shifting towards something where referenda are held to resolve issues that emerge within the Scottish Parliament. And in that context, I think if you are thinking about listing a particular range of policy areas where you will suggest that referenda are to be held, then you go into the territory really where parliamentary sovereignty and popular sovereignty come into increasing conflict. And I think that one of the experiences of 2014 and the Scottish independence referendum and the 2016 European Union referendum is that produces a binary effect in society, which is often in conflict with the multi-party framework of the Scottish Parliament itself. So I think that there is greater need to think about the implications of increasing the number of referenda in terms of that broader framework of political culture.
Teresa?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the bill as it's kind of currently constructed appears to be providing an enduring framework for the regulation of referendum campaigns. I think this question kind of taps into a kind of higher order question, which is under what circumstances and for what types of issues would you hold referendums? And in a way, it actually comes up in one of the questions that you pose around citizens' initiatives, because I think it gets at this broader question of what kinds of referendums. Is it purely constitutional issues, ordinary legislation? I mean, what you're talking about is ordinary legislation, but it would be triggered by a minister. But in a citizens' initiative, obviously, citizens could initiate legislation in particular areas. The international experience is actually generally that budgetary issues are excluded from citizens' initiatives, and they're would be quite uncommon in relation to in relation to top-down referendums on ordinary legislation. There are some examples in the United States, very famously in California, where a citizens' initiative affected property tax, and it was a very significant contributor actually to the near bankruptcy of the Californian state. And so a lot of designers, when it comes to these types of questions, tend to actually leave specifically budgetary and foreign policy and kind of minority protection rights. They specifically preclude them, in fact, from referendum procedures for that very reason.
I was going to say something similar in the sense that budgetary mechanisms can be excluded. So you could think of, instead of thinking what's included, you could think of what's excluded within the context of the legislation. I think in the case of your particular example, one could also think that serious consideration of whatever you're going to call it, the regulated period, the relevant period, how long the referendum campaign has to be, would mean that certain pieces of legislation, such as trying to run through the budget, might be problematic. If the regulated period is long enough, then you would have a period of time where you would have this uncertainty around the budget, which might, in and of itself, be a stop against that sort of behavior. I think I would perhaps come back on the shifting of the Scottish political culture idea. One might also think, on the flip side, that maybe this is just extending the Scottish political culture. If we go back to the foundational principles of the Scottish Parliament, openness, transparency, and participation were some of the core founding principles by which the Scottish Parliament was set up, which led us to things like the petition system, things like cross-party groups, ways of bringing the public into the political sphere. One might think that those have not shown to their fullest brightness, and therefore extending these sorts of mechanisms could possibly lead to a sort of a more participatory democracy.
Alex Burnett. I've got to remember there are two Alexes now.
Which one?
You're Alec and you're Alex. That'll help me out. Thank you. Alec and Alex. So Alex, on you go.
Thank you, convener. My questions around the Electoral Commission in relation to question testing. Yeah, and last week we heard very strong evidence about the Electoral Commission being consulted on question testing, and that it should take place even when a question has previously been tested or proposed. I just wonder if the panel would like to share their views on that matter.
I think it's very good practice for an independent body to be involved in question testing. It's the precise wording, I think my colleagues will say more the experts on this than I, but the precise wording of a question can obviously affect the result. It therefore follows that it's important that we have an independent body there acting as a check and balance in order to ensure that the question is reasonable, fair, and is fully tested.
It clearly matters, and it may well be something that's not just simply involves the Electoral Commission, but also citizens themselves. And this is the kind of issue that does work well in a citizens' assembly. And one of the things which can seem at times to be rather abstract to voters is the idea that the contours, the conventions of any referenda are designed by people that are not entirely accountable to them. And so there may well be a need to consider both that independent input from the Electoral Commission, but also from some form of citizen representation.
Yeah, in general, it's a very good thing to have an independent electoral commission consult on the question, and I think having a degree of flexibility about the design of the question is important. And just to give you some evidence from Ireland, the phrasing of the question is actually set down in law in Ireland, in legislation. So each referendum question actually asks you whether you agree with the legislation to the 38th Amendment to the Constitution, and in brackets maybe a summary phrase which may or may not be apparent as to what actually that referendum is really about. And we do have evidence to show that actually this sometimes causes voter confusion, that they find it difficult to vote. And in particular, we've had examples where there's been a negative built into the question: do you agree with abolishing this House of Parliament? That voters find it very difficult. And actually, we've evidence to show some voters voted in the opposite to their clear intentions. So having flexibility in terms of the design of the question, I think, is a very useful thing. And in particular, having an independent body involved is definitely the right road to go down, because I think ours is far too inflexible, and we've evidence to show that it hasn't served us well.
Yeah, I would agree with that, absolutely. That international evidence across these sorts of things shows that question testing is a good thing. I think your question, though, gets at to whether the second testing of either the same question or something very, very close to the same question. If there's any deviation from the previous question, then I think that means yes, that testing it would be appropriate. The question, I think, is whether or not the same question being run again deserves further testing. Probably the answer would be yes, I think, in that public understanding of political issues does change. And so we can use relatively recent examples to say that, you know, as public opinion changes, particularly on pre-legislative versus post-legislative questions, then even if within a relatively short period of time the same question is being rerun, you probably would want some degree of testing. Now, whether that would necessarily require the full 12 weeks, you might question that, but you would want some degree of confirmation or other sorts of testing.
And Professor Cowan, just as a follow-up on what you were saying earlier about being able to look objectively at the bill and separating out, you know, future referendums from past referendums, you know, do you think that the specific provision reference in the bill to a previous reference, you know, the only one being the 2014 referendum in the previous question, is helpful?
That one's a difficult one to say, I suppose. I mean, you probably want the bill in and of itself to be as neutral and removed from previous experience, I would imagine, as you can, if only because if you think about the sort of legal precedents that are established by having previous examples referenced, that might cause some issues down the road.
Thank you, Convener. Just following up, because this is an issue, as a member of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, I explored with colleagues with the Cabinet Secretary yesterday, and pertaining to the question around independence in the 2014 question, one of the points that the Cabinet Secretary made, which I'd be keen to hear your views on, is that the question that was used in 2014 has been used in almost every opinion poll since then. I think over 50 opinion polls. It's commonly understood, and as such, it would perhaps be create unnecessary confusion to deviate from that. I would just be keen to hear your views on what the Cabinet Secretary has stated, whether you agree or you disagree.
Yes, I can see that. In a way that now runs contrary to what I just said. In the sense that, you know, you might want to retest. You know, even John Curtis would recognize the fact that there is error in polls, and depending on sampling methodology and how one ran those surveys, you know, you do get slightly different responses to these sorts of questions. And nonetheless, just because something is used in public opinion polls doesn't mean that the public necessarily understands what they're responding to. And there can be certainly ways of improving question wording in polls. As a member of the Scottish Election Study team, you know, we ran the same questions over and over again, recognizing that over time they tend to lose their sort of meaning to the public or change their meaning. So nonetheless, I would still think some sort of independent evaluation. As I say, since a question has been used repeatedly in polls, you might not then require the full 12 weeks or the full period of time that the Electoral Commission would require to test a fully unique question, but you still probably want to have some independent experts look at it just to certify that this is in fact still a fair and reasonable question.
I think that if you think about the influence of the independence question, however you frame it over the last decade on Scottish society, that regardless of what the question, how the question is framed, that many people will translate it into how they see the question, and they will simply reinforce their particular view. There is, of course, a constituent of don't knows, or those that are prepared to shift their view, but much of the evidence suggests that many people in Scotland, regardless of how you frame the question, recourse to a position that they have on that which is rather fixed.
I think just drawing from some of the evidence in the Republic of Ireland, we've had multiple referendums on many different issues. So I think it's good to think it in a kind of a broader question. And the question wording doesn't necessarily dictate the direct lines that the campaigns will take. So we had a referendum on divorce in '86. sorry, 83 or 86, and then another one again in 95. The questions were almost identical, but they were very different outcomes and very different types of campaigns. The underlying shifts are in public opinion and on kind of particularly deeply rooted kind of cleavage type issues like that. Opinion change happens kind of very slowly over kind of long periods of time. So the question, it's important, it's clear, it's important that voters understand what it means. It's important that any underpinning legislation that might be implemented in the outcome is clear and direct, but the question itself will not necessarily determine the type of campaign that you're going to have, the kinds of issues that are going to come up in the campaign. It's the participants in the campaign and the issues kind of that are live. Those can change over time, even with the kind of stability in the same question. And we have had this experience with kind of fairly intractable social moral issues, but you see it also in relation to the repeat of European Union referendums. We've had a couple of those run over again, and you get very different debates. Economic circumstances can change, socioeconomic conditions, and that's really kind of what, if you want, delivers the final outcome. The crucial thing with the question is that it is clear and understandable to the voters.
One final question, just a supplementary to a matter raised by Professor Carman, and that was perhaps of an expedited process for the Electoral Commission to engage. It would be likely whether a referendum was made through regulation or primary legislation that a committee, perhaps this committee, would take evidence, and so there would be an opportunity for the Electoral Commission via that process of engagement to give some at least a preliminary view or a provisional opinion. Would that be a forum where the Electoral Commission could at least give an opinion, do you think? Would that be a means of perhaps, rather than a full 12-week period of testing, give their informed view?
Yes, they could. Obviously, it depends. It's up to the committee who you invite to give evidence, but one would think that yes, the Electoral Commission could then come and provide it. One could think that this depends on when the committee hearing is held. Does the Electoral Commission have enough time to gather evidence before it's invited to provide evidence to this committee or any other committee? And then you also, I think, have another layer of consideration there about sort of public perception. If this process is run through the Parliament, that might be seen to politicize the testing of the question. So you might then think about whether or not you need another, again, a sort of more independent view, as opposed to whether the view would come through a parliamentary committee.
But a simple point, I was making an opportunity for the Electoral Commission, either orally or written, to submit evidence giving their view. So it would not be the case that we would be ignorant of what the Electoral Commission's view was.
Assuming that they're granted enough time, and then the question is, what is that amount of time? Do you then need to legislate for that amount of time? So there is then the question about what the timing of that would be.
I think we have the Electoral Commission before us, and look forward to asking. Thank you.
Really?
Could I just on that same theme, I mean, in terms of legitimacy, is it important that referendums are seen to be legitimate and not being set up by any, well, the governing party, shall we say? So if the governing party, the government, decide to want a referendum and then that they're going to determine the question that's going to be put, is there a danger there that brings into question the whole legitimacy? And if circumstances have significantly changed, I think Ireland was at Maastricht when there was another referendum there, and I need to look at whether that was different, yeah. But if you're going to rerun a referendum, but the circumstances have significantly changed, is there not a danger again that if the governing party just simply insist on their question, that the whole legitimacy of the referendum is pulled into question? And if you've got a divided country going into a referendum where the legitimacy of even the question has been pulled into question, you know, is that good for democracy?
I think if you're talking about the question of legitimacy, the framing of the question is one element, but I think what we've learned, particularly from the European Union referendum of 2016, and to a lesser extent the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, is that legitimacy can be questioned on a number of areas. The way in which the different campaigns are using facts or being less in securing what they're claiming. Also, the way in which the campaigns are funded. And if we think about particularly the European Union campaign, it is a remarkable feat that both Remainers and Leavers have come to the conclusion that for many people that referendum wasn't legitimate. And I think in many ways that highlighted the fact that the British government rushed into the referendum, didn't think of the conventions, didn't give the electorate enough time to learn about the issues. So when you go back to 2014, there are many things which I think were appropriate. The period of learning, the 2-year period, allowed Scottish society to both understand and comprehend the issues concerned. And although at times the campaign was febrile and rather hotly contested, both campaigns largely provided the electorate with substantiated cases for and against the proposition. That was not the case in the 2016 European Union referendum. Both sides were loose with the truth at times. So I think that, yes, the question is an issue, but it is that wider political approach towards how the campaign is run that often produces challenges to legitimacy.
But is it not crucial that at the start of you actually, in 2014, for example, there was an agreement, all parties that came together and agreed the question? Is it not crucial that you have some kind of at least agreement on what you're going to ask?
But yes, on a personal basis, yes, I strongly support that position. I think it's very important that all sides, all political parties and also citizens, as I go back to the idea of having a citizen input, have some sense in which they have legitimised that process at the beginning. Because if not, then you will find that the legitimacy of the referendum will be contended even before it's been held.
I think a really important starting point in terms of legitimacy is that there is clarity about the circumstances in which a referendum can be called and who is responsible for calling it. Because then all referendums are created under the same type of structures. And that's really a starting point for creating legitimacy, that the instrument is applied and used equally within the system. So that gets back to this question of is it on constitutional matters, ordinary legislation, who can trigger? I think there's a kind of a second point then, though, which is in relation to the likelihood of the success of referendums. And the international evidence is that when there's cross-party consensus, particularly when there's parliamentary consultation and agreement around the referendum issue, there's a greater chance of it actually being successful. So just work I was reading yesterday in relation to constitutional amendments in Central and Eastern Europe, they have a much higher chance of passing in referendums if there is some degree of cross-party consensus around that. But I think that's a political issue, and that's one that then translates into the campaign. But the starting point has to be clarity about what types of issues you're going to deal with in referendum and how they're going to be triggered, because that really does give you an enduring framework and a way of delivering referendums which voters can understand and will become more familiar with over a period of time. And that, I think, helps underpin and build broader legitimacy for the referendum instrument as a general tool of making decisions. Regarding this idea of revisiting questions, I mean, lots of countries revisit referendum questions. It's the same is true in relation to citizens' initiatives. The same kinds of things keep coming up over and over again. And I think that comes to this much bigger question of how your direct democracy intersects with your representative democracy. You know, again, who can trigger referendums, and when results come out that perhaps run contrary to other policy issues or more complex, what's the role for representative democracy then to address those kinds of issues? And those are very big design questions about a system which I think have to be understood and addressed, but should be understood and addressed in a broader sense rather than through the prism of a particular, albeit very live, referendum issue.
Professor Fisher last week, who was one of the people who gave us evidence, said that polling companies constantly review their questions because the questions rapidly go out of date in respect of people's understanding of what they mean. Now, I think Tom that talked about the number of times that polling companies have used the question that was used in 2014. If polling companies, and I'm struggling with this in my head, if polling companies therefore have not altered the question over that period, Can we assume, therefore, that polling companies are comfortable that its understanding has not been lost? Because there's a conundrum in here.
Not necessarily. There's a variety of reasons why one wouldn't change the question. Particularly if you're running the questions for either academic research or media purposes, one important factor is just having a longitudinal timeline of the same question. Because, since we've sort of already established, small changes in question wording can lead to quite different response rates or responses to those questions. Therefore, even if you think the question is slightly not asking exactly what you want it to be asking, you might ask the same question over and over again, because at least then you have the same question being put to the public. That way you have a timeline of responses.
Does that itself not then create a confusion if it then changes?
Possibly. This then goes back to this idea of whether or not you would ask, whether or not you would have an independent body at least look at the evidence. Now, they could use all the evidence from the polling firms. They don't necessarily need to run their own surveys. They could get the evidence from the polling firms. You could do some statistical analysis to find out how stable responses are over time across different groups, and then you have a sense for whether or not the public still understands the question in the same way.
Okay. Neil.
If the justification for running a second referendum is on the basis of a material change in circumstances, then it's not the same question or proposition being asked. Do you not think in those circumstances that the Electoral Commission should fully be involved in testing the question?
Just to add, really, I mean, I do think that the Electoral Commission should be fully involved, and I can't see any advantage necessarily in limiting the role or the time available for them to have to do that.
I think if you're considering that question of legitimacy, even if it is simply a confirmatory process, I think it is appropriate for every referenda, if it is repeating an issue or even if the material circumstances change, that you go through that process just so that you bind in and buy in as many citizens as possible to the legitimacy of that particular referendum.
Okay, John, did I see you want to ask a question there? No. Okay. Well, I'm coming to you now anyway, on the Irish experience. So.
Thanks very much. Yeah, we've had a lot of evidence so far. I mean, some of the things you say in your evidence, Dr. Reedy, I found it interesting, so I wanted to maybe pursue some of that. I mean, you've already mentioned today that some referenda might be on contentious issues, and clearly a lot of people on both sides, but some might not be. And I just wondered if you could maybe give us an example of that, maybe from Ireland or whatever, because I don't think we've had any that weren't contentious here, so I'm interested in that. And then following on from that, your suggestion that the Electoral Commission or someone should provide objective information, and if that would only be for the non-contentious referenda, or if it should be for the contentious referenda.
Well, if I might answer your second question first, I think if you conceive of this as an enduring framework that would apply to all referendums, I think as a principle, the same rules should apply to all referendums in relation to those kinds of technical matters. So if it's a piece of good practice that the Electoral Commission would comment on all questions, I think that should apply to all referendums. And equally, if the Referendum Commission or Electoral Commission provides objective information, it should do that over time. And the kind of key learning from the Irish experience is that voters have become very familiar with the information that is provided by the Referendum Commission. They expect to get the leaflet in the post. They listen to the advertisements. The chairperson of the Referendum Commission participates in a lot of public information sessions, and a lot of the research evidence we have is that as a result of that, the Referendum Commission information is highly valued. It's very influential in shaping voters' positions and understanding of issues, and the Referendum Commission is very much trusted by the voters. But that's not something that happened overnight. That's because of the cumulative experience of running referendums, and we've been having kind of about a referendum a year for the last 10 to 15 years, so there's been a cumulative build-up. In relation to the referendum... Can
I just press you on that point then? I mean, so how much detail, what kind of information do the Electoral Commission give? Because, I mean, my impression here is that what we've had so far it's just been quite insipid. It's about which box to tick, and which box to tick and things like that. Whereas when it was the European referendum, I mean, we were having a big debate about, you know, the health service is going to get so much more money if we leave, or it's not. And I mean, would the Electoral Commission comment on anything like that?
I mean, what the Referendum Commission does in Ireland is it provides information that is objective and factual, which is not disputed. Now, there are limits to that because there are still going to be areas where there's very substantive elements of contention. But
future then, could it?
Well, for example, if I might give you an example of the Fiscal Stability Bill, Fiscal Stability Treaty, which was the most recent EU referendum that we had in Ireland. The Referendum Commission developed a piece of information explaining what the contents of the Fiscal Stability Treaty was about, what the implications would be for Irish budgetary policy, the Commission oversight of the budgetary policy, and all of that was fairly objective information. Then the chairperson of the Referendum Commission participated in public interviews and debates on these questions. So a persistent thread running through European referendums in the Republic of Ireland is that the legislation or that the treaty is about to bring in abortion, and that it's going to supersede the constitutional provisions that were at that point in the Constitution in relation to abortion. The chairperson of the Referendum Commission was able to conclusively say there is nothing in the Fiscal Stability Treaty about abortion. It is not going to affect abortion rights one way or the other. So that's a kind of a now, it's not always that clear-cut, but there's a nice clear-cut example of where the Referendum Commission can shut down a line of argument. To go to your first question in relation to the types of referendums, in the Republic of Ireland, referendums happen because there is a requirement to change the Constitution. The Constitution
that's the only time you have referendums? We
have legal provision for what are called ordinary referendums, which would be the kind of policy referendums that were mentioned earlier, but they've never actually been used. So the only types of referendums we've had have been in relation to constitutional changes. Now, the Constitution is a fairly comprehensive document, and as a consequence, as we have kind of outgrown the mores of the 1930s, we've had to have a lot more referendums in more recent years. So you've heard probably lots about the marriage equality referendums and abortion. We've had lots of questions on that, but we've also had lots of referendums on quite technical issues to do with kind of legal and political institutional design, which are in the Constitution. So the Houses of Parliament, the courts, one in, for example, 2011 related to whether parliamentary inquiries could be held under particular sorts of circumstances. Now, it's very hard to find even members of Parliament who have very strong views on parliamentary inquiries. Finding citizens on the street who have views is even more difficult. So there's an example of a referendum where there really was very little information and very few strong views amongst the voters on that position. So it was very important that the Referendum Commission stepped into the field and provided information on what the changes would mean that were being brought in, how they would be implemented, what the consequences would be. Now, ultimately, that referendum was actually defeated. And this kind of brings me to kind of probably a bigger point about referendums. There's a very interesting piece of work by a Canadian political scientist who classifies the types of issues on which we have referendums. And he talks about these kind of big cleavage issues. If I might say, Scottish independence is probably in the big cleavage issues. Unification of Ireland is also in that. And these are issues where people have really fundamental views on the topic. They're kind of sincere value type issues, and we expect their opinions to change really slowly on those kinds of issues. Then you've got these kind of mid-range of issues which are more kind of technical policy things. European Union referendums in Ireland would fall into that category, kind of what's in them, what do the political parties, the civil society actors say about them are very influential. And then you've got these kind of more technical issues over here on the other side, which are really things that come up over time. They might relate to a very specific policy issue at a point in time, and they can be quite volatile, like the parliamentary inquiries referendum in the Republic of Ireland, where people really don't have actually any opinion on the issue 3 weeks before the referendum actually happens. And then there's a process of opinion formation during the campaign, and of course with each new piece of information you might actually change your mind because there's this rapid opinion formation. So today you hear something, you're in favour of opinion of Oireachtas inquiries. Tomorrow all these attorneys general come out and say this is a very dangerous change, and you change your mind back again because you're not making a decision kind of from a place of fundamental values on the topic. And we have referendums across the spectrum, but I think a lot of the way this legislation is kind of envisaged is through the prism of these more kind of cleavage, fundamental type questions.
I mean, can I ask, is that also why you seem to suggest financing both sides of a campaign just to create a campaign if there's not one there.
Yeah.
So we might not need to do that if we're only dealing with contentious issues?
Yeah, so if you're only dealing with contentious issues and the kind of intention is that there won't be these types of technical referendums, it might not be necessary for you to do that. For example, in Ireland, even though we do have those kinds of technical referendums fairly regularly, we actually don't do it. But a consequence of that is that we've done some post-referendum research, which shows that voters tended not to know very much about the issue. Often there wouldn't have been posters, there might not have been too much by way of debate. And one solution that's often been proposed is that there would be small amounts of money provided to campaign groups. Now, one thing to keep in mind is, in a way, you're artificially creating a no side, and there is concern that you could actually be giving money to people who might be using it as a platform to campaign for something else. So you do have to be very careful about how you would go down that road. But I suppose it's just to be aware that some referendums can actually take place on very technical types of things and may not generate very much interest or intensity by the voters or the political parties.
Okay, thanks so much. I realise I was aiming at Professor Dr. Reedy, but I think one or two others come in. Professor Campbell.
So coming quickly on relating to the sort of very beginning of this conversation about the role of the Electoral Commission. So far, we've had a variety of questions about the Electoral Commission, and it's been mentioned in a variety of different ways. So jotting it down, so far we've talked about the Electoral Commission providing fair and neutral and balanced information to the public on the content of a referendum. We've talked about it being involved in the regulatory processes of the referendum. We've talked about it administering and running referenda, and you talked about it testing questions. Now, I think Alistair Clark, in his paper that he prepared, noted that one of the advantages of this piece of legislation is that it separates out the regulatory function and the administering function, administering function going to electoral management boards. So I think you would want to think clearly within the context of this piece of legislation, what is the role of the Electoral Commission that you would envisage? You could picture that if it's in charge of, say, providing fair, neutral, balanced information, you might want to separate that out from the regulatory function, which you've already separated from the administering function. So it's becoming quite complex.
Practice on that, or is it just very varied around the world?
My sense it's rather varied. Certainly in the United States, if you look across all 50 states, there are different processes in place for regulating information. As you can imagine, in the U.S. it tends to be, no holds barred, everybody goes in for it. And that's quite problematic, as we've seen before, if you don't sort of regulate the sorts of information in information flows, particularly with internet and online access and those sorts of things.
Thanks so much.
Just to sort of take that on, in some senses, there is an important requirement for an independent body to provide information for the electorate about the context, the issues, and the consequences of any referendum. I think what's been proven with both the 2014 Scottish independence referendum and the 2016 European Union referendum is that the government body stimulating the referenda cannot be relied on to provide that impartial information. In both cases, that was not the case. But beyond that, there is a really important question about the learning period. And there is strong evidence to suggest that anything around 10 weeks, which is the usual norm for UK referendum in terms of the campaign period, doesn't provide the electorate with a sufficient ability to actually gain an appreciation of the issues concerned. American research on political psychology suggests that about 6 weeks before an election, most electors move from being objective about trying to consider both sides of any issue and go to a more emotional response, and that tends to be less evidence, less fact-driven. So there is...
Their decision of 6 weeks
or
before.
that they close down to the idea that there are multiple perspectives on a particular issue, and they tend then to go to a more emotional response. I think the Scottish independence referendum, with a 2-year lead-in, provided much of Scotland with that chance to learn about the issues. It possibly was too long. In many ways, it became something which, was almost all-enveloping, and people felt slightly exhausted by the end of the process. At the same time, the European Union referendum has proven that such a short period did not allow many segments of the electorate on both sides to fully appreciate the other side's arguments. And so I think that when you're considering this bill, one of the things that needs to be considered is that period of campaigning and considering issues of the electorate learning about the issues within the context of deciding that period.
Thanks very much.
Gordon.
Thanks very much, Convener. Before we look at how we encourage voters to participate in referendum, I was wanting to ask you about voter registration. Scotland's population is at a record high, yet the ONS produced a report in March of this year that highlights that Scottish voter registration has dropped in 65% of council wards, comparing December 2017 with December 2018. So, is there a particular difficulty with voter registration in Scotland, or is, you know, what's underlying this drop-off in voter registration?
So there is a problem with voter registration. That's UK-wide. There's been a long-term decline in voter registration rates since the Second World War period. Part of the reasons for that are changing lifestyles and so on. One particular intervention was the move to individual electoral registration here. And this came in 2014, but importantly came in at different points in England and Wales that it did to Scotland. So, for example, in the independence referendum, that was a referendum still running under household registration. Now, it's widely thought that one of the effects of individual electoral registration was to reduce the completeness of the electoral register. It did some positive things, increased the accuracy, reduced some opportunities for electoral fraud, but research does show that young people in particular were kind of negatively affected by that, and students. And of course, what we're thinking, so if you think back to 2014, what you therefore had was a system where one head of households, as it was defined, could complete a registration form for everybody in that property. And if you're thinking of a 16-year-old, who potentially would be included in the franchise for subsequent referendums, or a 17-year-old, that would have meant that parents would have, in that instance, possibly filled that in on their behalf. So it's estimated that, I think of 18 to 24-year-olds, roughly a third were missing outside of peak election season. I think possibly 8 million people are either missing entirely from the electoral register or incorrectly registered across the UK. So this could be a challenge in any kind of subsequent referendum. So, I mean, some of the things that I put forward in my evidence, which kind of draw from a report on the missing millions still missing, point to ways in which public service agencies could play a role in registering to people to vote. So there are interventions, and this also places considerable pressures on electoral officials as well. I mean, you'll hear from them next week. But the types of pressures that you hear, for example, are last-minute spikes in registration applications. So you can see, at the moment in the UK, we've seen something like 250,000 applications over the last week, just because people have been mentioned that word general election. 2016 Brexit referendum, the voter registration website crashed because there's so much volume, and every single application electoral officials then have to process and check whether this person is registered. So this is a potential problem.
To a method of head of household registration, or should we have some form of automatic or compulsory registration, i.e. when you get your national insurance card when you're 16, you're automatically registered to vote at that time?
I think it'd be difficult to move all the way back to household registration. I think there are some advantages in that it's a Victorian system, but certainly some interventions of automatic registration seem to be clear winners, and exactly the one you identify there of 16-year-olds. At the moment, they're sent a letter telling them what their national insurance number is. It's a very important moment kind of for them. They could also be at least encouraged to register to vote at the moment, but why not simply add them to the electoral register there as well?
Anybody else got any views on it?
We're currently working with electoral registration officers across the UK on this question. National insurance would not work in Scotland because the age of registration is 14 for some elections and 16 for others. I was a member of the Youth Citizenship Commission, which sat in 2008-2009. The UK government convened independence commission on this issue, and we recommended that automatic registration is introduced. Schools could easily oversee this. It would save a considerable amount of money in both the short and long term. There are GDPR issues because under 16s do have separate conventions, and I would urge you to think about this. If that is not the step you take, then there is the potential that in Scotland, citizenship education is a statutory subject. It is not uniformly or universally taught well at present, but in Wales, they are considering, with the introduction of low voting age 16 for local and national parliamentary elections, that as part of that programme, there is an opportunity for all 14-year-olds to have an opportunity to sign on the electoral register as part of their political education or citizenship education. I strongly urge you to consider that.
Okay. And in terms of, you touched upon political education, looking at turnout figures, in the EU referendum, 64% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted, is my understanding, but 80% of 65 to 74-year-olds voted. And in the independence referendum of 2014, 75% of 16 to 18-year-olds voted and 92% of 55 plus. What do we do to try and address that discrepancy in turnout by age group?
I think first and foremost, and it's one of the issues that when the voting age was lowered in 2014 for the independence referendum and then subsequently for local and Scottish National Parliament elections, that the issue of youth democratic socialisation wasn't considered at the same time in a developed manner. And I would urge that that is something that should be redressed. Different local authorities in Scotland provide different levels of citizenship education. About a third of young Scots take the modern studies curriculum, so they do get a good level of political education, but there's clear evidence that sizable numbers of young Scots do not receive appropriate political education. So regardless of the issue, they are uncertain about that. I think there's also a second question, which is not simply about 16 and 17-year-olds. The biggest drop in turnout is actually 18 to 24-year-olds. There is something happening there which is clearly problematic. I think that it is not an issue particularly with one group of 18 to 24-year-olds, but particularly those that don't go to university seem not to turn out. And I think there that it's not just simply a question of statutory political education in schools and colleges before young people are enfranchised, but also that political parties need to think about the places and spaces that these young voters congregate, particularly those not in some form of education after 18, and make sure that they not only that they understand the issues, but they feel as though they're listened to and that they're represented in a way. And I think one of the things which hasn't yet really affected Scottish political culture has been that lowering the voting age hasn't seen any real change in the way political parties appeal to younger voters. We haven't seen policy making change radically yet, and young people's voices are not yet voluble enough. But also that the age of representatives within this august institution and at local authorities hasn't changed. In fact, since the voting age has been lowered in 2016, the average age of this institution has actually gone up. So I think there is something there to think about, that broader way in which Scottish politics resonates and reflects to younger voters.
Just to agree absolutely with all of that, and obviously, political education should begin in schools. I mean, it's interesting that the Act does encourage again, the statutory bodies to have a responsibility to promote participation. I mean, I guess what I'd also add there is some caution in terms of how effective they can be in doing that. Obviously, public organisations and have many skills and well-trained staff and so on. But I think the ability to try to kind of capture the kind of grassroots mechanisms there. So, for example, perhaps having some kind of board where you have charities and schools involves there. Thinking about perhaps grants or competitions where money can be given to kind of small organisations, so you can have these kind of democracy champions to get everyone to vote. That's the way in which you can kind of reach those hard to reach communities, and you can make a positive contribution.
Yes.
Our evidence is from a study that we undertook actually following 2014 referendum, where we surveyed teachers and students in west of Scotland. And some of the very clear findings were that teachers certainly felt that the guidance coming from local councils and head teachers was quite varied across council areas and then across schools, if you talk about head teachers, to where some teachers felt that they were strongly discouraged from discussing controversial political issues. And so relying without some sort of mechanism, just sort of, oh, the schools will take care of that, is highly problematic. 20% of secondary schools in Scotland do not offer modern studies. So there's a limit there in which students actually even have access to taking modern studies classes. And then if we look at the curriculum for excellence, of course, it sort of says that citizenship education should be taken across the entirety of the school years and across all subjects. But in our survey, it's pretty clear that most teachers who were not modern studies teachers who responded to our survey felt that that was solely the area in which modern studies were supposed to handle it. So topics such as history, for instance, I think only 20-something percent, 26% maybe, of teachers felt that citizenship was something that they should talk about within the context of history, where you might imagine that would be one subject that certainly you could think about how that could be integrated into the curriculum. So it's fairly clear that political literacy is not integrated across the entirety of the curriculum. Therefore, you have to be very careful in how you think about this, and that's why in our evidence or recommendations, we said that you would need to think about mechanisms, whether that's secondary legislation or within the context of this bill itself or something further on, about how the role of schools is measured. Because what this means is students across Scotland are exposed to different levels of information, inconsistent information, and there's obvious questions about fairness then.
I mean, I accept the point of what you've said there, but, you know, the biggest area of concern for me is 18 to 24-year-olds, where the turnout was only 54%. So, I mean, there obviously is an issue that has to be addressed. But I was curious about the Irish situation. Do you witness differential turnouts by age?
Yes, and we have a particularly acute differential between younger voters and older voters, which I think is second only in European data to the United Kingdom. I think it's worth noting that the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland are actual outliers at this point in terms of voter registration procedures. By having voluntary procedures, most other European countries have automatic registration procedures, and it simply removes a barrier to voting. That being said, though, the international research does tell us that things that you do to make it easier for voters to get to the polls, things like early voting and postal voting, they help a small percentage of voters, but the overall impact on turnout tends to be quite modest, so it's only a couple of percentage points. The kind of fundamental issues lies on this question of what mobilises you to vote, interest in politics, and your belief that politics affects you, and unfortunately that's a much more difficult conundrum to address.
Just saying that quickly, that in the United States, some of the experiments that they've tried of putting polling stations in shopping malls, for instance, that's one of the few where you start to see it actually having some sort of, again, it's usually a few percent, but it's a start, in terms of the age profile of the sorts of people. You combine that with automatic registration, and you start to see slight changes to age.
Okay.
Sorry, Toby.
I mean, another American example there was that there was 20-25 years ago, but the legislation with the National Voter Registration Act that required particular public agencies to ask people to register to vote when they came into contact with them. I mean, again, that's something, given that the Scottish Government has obviously a wide variety of public agencies under its responsibility, is something that could be implemented as part of it. Just, you know, you could come to see us about this. By the way, do you want to register to vote today? That everyday kind of conversation could make a big difference.
Okay, thanks so much. Patrick, online issues.
Thank you very much. Mina, good morning. There have been a few sort of side comments around regulation of the digital space, around donations and the accountability of money as it flows through the political system, and around accuracy of information. And I wanted to sort of draw together some of those threads. I think I've got Dr. Reedy's written submission here. As concerns about misinformation grow, it's likely that the role of independent electoral commissions will become more crucial in providing comprehensive information which can be trusted by voters. And I'm worried that if we rely on that kind of argument, we slightly miss the effect of the way that digital campaigning is happening at the moment, in a way that's not only having the effect, but designed to achieve the effect of undermining voters' trust in objective information, and simply offering the voters the choice of which source of information they choose to subscribe to, rather than recognising that anything's objective. So I'd like to know what your view is about the bill in terms of how well it innovates in terms of regulating online activity, how much more scope there might be for innovating in that area, and obviously, where is the balance between respecting freedom of speech and actually holding people to account for telling objective lies? You know, that there is a difference between expressing a contentious or a contested opinion and saying, for example, Turkey, population 76 million, is joining the EU. That is a barefaced lie, or was during the campaign. Now the EU wants to ban tea kettles. These are objective lies. And once they're out there into the digital space, they may be being shared by individuals rather than by companies who can be held to a digital imprint. But if all of that money is going into the campaign in the last few days or weeks, the effect is had, and it's too late. So what potential is there to engage with this new area of campaigning, this new form of campaigning, and effectively regulate it?
Go on, Teresa.
I'm afraid there is no answer to that question.
That was my fear.
And it's a conversation that's being had in parliaments all across Europe. And in fact, it was a particularly acute conversation in the run-up to the European Parliament elections earlier this year. You know, challenging disinformation and even dealing with micro-targeting of voters, like what you've heard a lot about in relation to Cambridge Analytica. They pose very significant challenges. They pose challenges because of the nature of the medium, but then there's also the secondary issue that they're transnational in their very nature. And this is where the real regulatory challenge, I think, emerges, because you're effectively trying to regulate companies and platforms that may actually exist outside the state, and fundamentally, this is why it's a difficult thing to do. One of the ways that other countries are getting at this, of course, is to come together at a European level to try and work collaboratively with the companies that are involved in this. So if we just gloss over that particular point, I mean, effectively what was happening in advance of the European Parliament elections was that there was a code of conduct agreed between the social media platforms themselves and the European Commission, with the quid pro quo being that if the platforms didn't engage with this, ultimately the Commission would actually legislate. And whilst individual states may have particular difficulties, and even the Republic of Ireland, where most of these companies are actually located, faces this challenge, transnationally it's easier to address these types of issues, to have policies of good practice in relation specifically to the disinformation. Company is responding quickly to take down clear examples of disinformation, dealing with hate speech online, and then greater clarity around the micro-targeting of the ways in which people's data can be used by companies. So at the moment, there is a code of practice, but there is there is going to be European legislation that's going to actually bring this into the legislative arena and require this. But fundamentally, there are still going to be problems, because you can create national regulations, for example, in relation to financial transparency and advertising. So you can make it illegal for somebody to fund particular types of advertising campaigns. So we ban broadcast advertising in the Republic of Ireland. But of course, you can run all kinds of broadcast ads on YouTube on the particular referendum issue being run from a different place. You're relying ultimately on those platforms to come together and actually to decide, no, we are not going to take advertising revenue and we're not going to facilitate these types of contributions. And that did actually happen in the case of the abortion referendum in the Republic of Ireland. The companies actually came together and decided that they were not going to take advertising revenue, and that happened about 10 days out from the referendum, and it was seen as kind of disadvantaging the no side, but at the same time the margin of victory was so large, I think in the end that was a bit of a moot point. But ultimately you are going to have a direct cooperation or legislation interacting with the platforms, and you are relying on their adherence or compliance with those types of regulations in the full awareness that they are transnational in their very nature.
I certainly take the point that some sort of Europe-wide political institutions would be quite helpful here, and that's something I would have a lot of respect for. But in terms of this bill, no, I totally agree. In terms of this bill, it seems to me that simply things like digital imprints almost treat digital campaigning just like a form of leaflet, and that seems clearly inadequate. Are there any other views about what scope we have in this bill to ensure that the framework for referendums in future takes account of these new challenges?
I think that what Teresa says is true. You know, you're trying to address a moving target. You know, the growth of artificial intelligence is going to make these things even more difficult. And it may well be that this isn't a question just of regulation, but it's more a question of education. And I think that digital education of young people and of citizens more widely is something which has been largely overlooked. And in many ways, the problem with regulation is that it's addressing the symptoms of the problem rather than maybe some of the causes, which are that citizens themselves struggle to navigate what's an increasingly complex digital world. So I think in recommending that you think about political education for citizens across Scotland, but particularly young people, I would also say that digital education is something which is very important. I'd urge you to possibly connect with the House of Lords Select Committee at the moment, which is also looking at the question of digital democracy, because they may well be able to inform some of your work.
Listen, one area we've not covered, which we covered last week, is the issue of the Gould 6-month rule. And I just wanted, Toby, you made particular reference in your evidence to us where you talked about the establishment of this framework would make that goal being the 6-month rule, more realisable and put Scottish referendums onto more surer ground. Can you expand what you mean by more realisable and more surer ground?
Sure. So, I think at the start of the committee, you stated that one of the aims of the bill was to provide flexibility, but I think it also is to provide certainty about the legal framework for electoral officials, but also candidates and citizens as well. And certainly one of the challenges that electoral officials face, research has shown, has been both the variety, complexity of electoral legislation, referendums legislation, but also in some cases how this can arrive very late on. So obviously the Gould principles arrive from problems where legislation was late in 2007, and the bill here is a very important step forward in terms of providing some foundations, which is why I mentioned earlier that flexibility is that it can be a problem for how referendums are run. Obviously, there's the question here of 6 months for what legislation? Is this the bill? Is this enough? Or what about any kind of statutory instruments, regulations that follow? And I think, you'll hear the evidence from the electoral officials in due course, but I think from the research that I've taken with Dr. Clark, it's always clear that they prefer certainty. If they can know their budgets that they have available for the referendum, if they can know the date. If anyone's ever tried to organise a wedding, it's very difficult to get that venue in place. It's exactly the same for elections, and they're often said to be the most complex logistical task to be undertaken during peacetime. So as much information that can be provided to them, the better.
was going through my head, and I probably shouldn't ask the question between the similarity between weddings and elections, but I'll avoid that. I'll just probably say thank you, Deputy Convener, counselling me properly. Any other questions anybody else has? No other questions. Can I thank you very much for that helpful, interesting session? I now close this meeting of the Finance and Constitution Committee.